Welcome to this webinar on how to develop and test innovations in practice. My name is Duanka Lugji, and I'm joined here by my colleague Nick Axford. We're both from the Social Research Unit. We're a charity located in Dartington and Devon, dedicated to improving outcomes for children. We've divided our presentation into 6 sections, and Nick and I are going to take turns in doing the presentation.
So, what do we mean by innovation? Good innovation is more than having smart ideas. It's an incremental and often intensive process of theorizing, design, and testing to find out if something is needed, effective, liked, wanted, used, and scalable. In youth justice, innovation is concerned mainly with preventing or reducing crime and antisocial behaviour among young people. Innovation is inventing something brand new, but it's also adjusting something that already exists, its content, delivery, or context. For example, it would be innovative to develop a new program for tackling gang violence, but it would be just as innovative to adapt an American gang violence program for the UK. Also, innovation is ongoing, it doesn't stop. Even with well-established programs, the developer and others continue to adapt it for different groups and contexts, or in response to findings about variable impact, or because theoretical advances highlight a hitherto neglected theme or approach. So we've said a bit about what innovation is. We should also say something about what it isn't. Innovation is not intrinsically good. In industry, most products developed by innovators fall by the wayside. Only the best ideas gain traction, so it should be in youth justice. Some innovations lack sound logic models and are unlikely to work, or they seek to do badly what several evidence-based programs already do well. In such cases, energy is best channeled elsewhere. Also, innovation is rarely a great leap forward. It's often more about small steps. Most fields advance when new ideas build on, extend, and only occasionally depart from what exists. For example, the first fixed-wing aircraft to ever fly evolved through a series of experiments in which Orville and Wilbur Wright applied existing knowledge about aerodynamics and mechanics. And of course, the aeroplane has been developing ever since as people build on that knowledge and experience. Lastly, innovation is not just about adding. It can be about stopping doing things that have a negative impact, what might be termed improvement through subtraction. Most prevention involves addition, for example, a new law or program or service. But what about taking away interventions that we suspect are benign at best and harmful at worst? For example, there is evidence that arresting young people accelerates their criminal career. Could a variation in arrest policies help prevent future crime? It's a proposition that at least deserves to be tested. So, how can programs make the journey from innovation to proven impact? We think it's through well-designed, logical, and evidenced innovation that we can test what works in improving young people's outcomes and refine those innovations that we already know do work. We call this the innovation to impact pipeline. The YJB has also demonstrated its commitment to this goal with the development and publication of the innovation and evaluation in youth justice materials, which are designed to assist practitioners in developing and evaluating youth justice programs and interventions. Many organisations have a long-term ambition of moving their work further along this pipeline. Often, however, they don't know how to do this. You may recall the standards of evidence we described in previous webinars in this series. These have 4 dimensions. The first, intervention specificity, is about whether the design is focused, practical, and logical. Second, system readiness. Is there enough information and resources that come with an intervention so that it can be implemented in public service systems? Evaluation quality is concerned with whether evaluations of the intervention are sufficiently robust to give us confidence in what they tell us about intervention impact. And then, of course, impact concerns what robust evaluations tell us about the effect of the programme or intervention on child outcomes. We think these standards often offer one way for organisations to think about how to move their intervention along the innovation to impact pipeline. They can be used to ensure that every stage of the innovation to impact pipeline is thriving. All 4 dimensions of the standards are important, but it will be most appropriate to focus on a different combination of dimensions depending on what stage of development your intervention is at. Ideally, you would start off thinking about design, then you might move on to implementation. But after that, the process is likely to be non-linear as you move between testing what you're doing through evaluation and then refining the design and implementation of your intervention accordingly. You might already be delivering an intervention and come to the standards at the point of thinking about evaluation. But even then, the standards offer an opportunity to step back and think about how your intervention is designed and implemented and whether refinements are needed before subjecting it to a robust evaluation. And of course, ultimately, you want your intervention to meet all 4 of the standards. We don't have a one-size-fits-all roadmap for developing an evidence-based programme. This is because every intervention is different. But some work we did for the Greater London Authority Project Oracle a few years ago offers some pointers. In this work, we sketched a route for progressing up the standards of evidence, showing what needs to be done at each level. At the first level, called good intentions, the focus is on intervention specificity, for example, agreeing outcomes and target group. At the second level, called promising, attention is paid to preparing to test a logic model and developing training and implementation procedures, and so on, up to the 5th level, called system ready, where requirements include independent evaluation and getting ready for implementation in large public service systems. The advantage of this approach is that the requirements for progressing to the next level are explicit. The disadvantage is that the process is rarely as tidy as it is set out on the screen. For that reason, in the rest of the webinar, we focus on how to improve an innovation against all 4 dimensions of the standards, starting with intervention specificity. It should be noted that while we refer to these concepts and ideas in the context of our own standards of evidence, other organisations have similar ways of conveying this information. For example, the YJB's innovation and evaluation materials provide a framework for progressing against their own standards of evidence. I'm now going to hand over to Duan, who's going to talk about how to improve intervention specificity.
Okay, so for intervention specificity, you need to ask yourself 5 questions. First, who are you trying to help? Start by considering the stage of child development you're focusing on: preschool, primary school years, secondary school, or early adulthood. You also need to consider the stage of a problem at which you want to intervene. Do you want to prevent a problem from occurring, intervene early in its development, or promote the best possible recovery after a problem has occurred? Next, you should seek a more fine-grained description of the target group. If it's for primary school children, is it for all such children, or say 9 to 11-year-olds? If it's seeking to reduce antisocial behavior among at-risk adolescents, or is it Or how is at risk defined? Second, what are you trying to achieve? Focus on key developmental outcomes. These are ordinary landmarks in a child's development, which, if not achieved, will likely handicap the child well into adulthood. For example, if a child's reading is very behind by entry to secondary school, the negative consequences can be long-lasting. But address that, and it can lead to other positive outcomes. An emphasis on a few outcomes at most helps to keep the intervention focused. Use previous research to estimate how much progress is possible for the target group over a given period, being both ambitious and realistic. Third, what does your intervention comprise? In the design phase, interventions are often delivered by their creators, but lasting and widespread impact will depend on other people. They need to know what is provided, by whom, over what period, for how long, and with what frequency, where, and how. Since the success of an intervention rests on both fidelity and versatility, you need to say what is core and therefore immutable, and what is peripheral and therefore adaptable for a new context. So distinguish between sort of electronics and the apps, for example. That's a good metaphor. Fourth, what is the logic underpinning your intervention? Even the most complicated of successful interventions is underpinned by a simple, clear, and logical description of how the anticipated outcomes will be achieved with the target population. So start by articulating a theory of the problem. Outline the risks that lead to the outcome you want to achieve, or the outcome, that you want to change. Next, add protective factors that ameliorate the impact of risks on well-being, on child well-being. Then propose intervention activities that will prevent the risk from happening in the first place, reduce the impact of the risk, break its connection with another risk, or boost the protective factors. Essentially, this is your theory of the solution. Lastly, test the connections for their logic. Is there really a connection between X and Y? Is it intuitive? Does it ring true for practitioners and families? Fifth, what is the evidence underpinning your intervention? Explore existing research on patterns of risk and protection that lead to poor outcomes you're seeking to address. There's also a wealth of knowledge about the kinds of things that are likely to work. For example, we know what type of parenting skill training improves child behavior, and when mentoring works and when it doesn't. Here we've considered how to sharpen the design of your intervention, but you can prepare it for, and how you can sort of prepare it for implementation. But put in another way, how can you improve it for system readiness? Okay, so you need to ask yourself 7 questions here. First, how will the intervention reach the right people? Connecting the right young people or families with an intervention is critical to achieving positive outcomes. A good place to start is by working out the level of need for the intervention. This means trying to establish roughly how many people in a given population fit the target group. So put in another way, approximately how many potential beneficiaries are there? Next, you need to estimate the level of demand. So how many of those who need the intervention will participate? So with these 2 pieces of information, you have a good idea of how many young people and families fit in your intervention. Now you have to find them. We dealt with approaches to doing this in the last webinar, so we won't go into detail in it now. Second, how will the people who implement the intervention be equipped with the necessary skills and knowledge? In industry, a distinction is made between sort of formal training, so a lecture on how to fly a plane, for example, simulator-based training, that's kind of the training that you get by pulling levers in a mocked-up cockpit, for example, and training on the job, so long hours of flying a plane under supervision. A lot of training in evidence-based programs is fairly formal, but role play, a kind of simulation, is common, as is coaching, a sort of a form of on-the-job training. A combination of these 2 is probably warranted. Third, how will different stakeholders understand what the intervention is and what their role is in its delivery? 2 documents are helpful here. Intervention manuals cover all the things about the interventions that are relevant wherever and whenever the intervention is implemented. For example, the basic intervention design and the relevant training or delivery materials. Implementation handbooks describe the processes and agreements for replicating an intervention in a new context. They don't re-specify the design unless it has been altered. Instead, they focus on the processes and the protocols that will be adopted for the replication. For example, they would detail the process for recruiting participants and monitoring fidelity. The human and financial resources required for replication are also included in them. Fourth, how much does the intervention cost, and who typically pays for it? Commissioners and funders interested in purchasing an intervention or replicating it in a new setting will need this information. A distinction can be made between startup costs, so those are the initial costs and investments needed to get the intervention set up in a new location, and recurrent costs. These are the year-on-year costs of running the intervention. So startup costs might include recruiting practitioners, providing initial training, and purchasing materials. But recurrent costs include staff time, rental costs of office space, and regular supervision. Fifth, what staff resources are needed to deliver the intervention? We discussed this at some length in the previous webinar, so we won't go into detail here. But in short, you need to specify how many people are needed and their required experience, knowledge, and qualifications and skills. The delivery of most interventions involve a team of people with complementary skills. Sixth, how are people who deliver the intervention supported to deliver it well? In many respects, the people who deliver an intervention in children's services are the intervention. For that reason, every effort should be made to help them be as knowledgeable and as skilled as possible. Training trends tend to focus on developing entry-level skills and knowledge, but the challenge comes when people try to put these skills and knowledge into practice. People usually need help to do this. This help can have several functions. The most important is to help practitioners to supplement their sort of formal knowledge obtained through reading the manual and attending training with something called craft knowledge. Another function is to respond to particular questions. For example, a teacher might want to know if they can adapt part of the intervention. Technical assistance might also entail personal support for a practitioner, for instance, after a difficult encounter with a user, and other such kinds. Seventh, what is the method for measuring whether the intervention is being delivered well? Presumably, you want your intervention to be delivered as you intend it to be delivered. You don't want someone taking your intervention but delivering it so badly that they might as well have done it something else. You want them to deliver your intervention with fidelity. We discussed fidelity at some length in the previous webinar, what it is and how to measure it. You also want to think about how the data will be used. At minimum, you want to feed it back to people delivering the intervention so that they can deliver it better. Just as a pilot gets continuous updates on how the plane is performing. Fidelity data can also help people providing technical assistance to decide what to focus on. Lastly, the service manager will benefit from an overview of how staff are doing, not least because it is one indicator of the suitability and quality of the training and technical assistance that the staff should receive. So I'm now going to pass it on to Nick for the final section on how to evaluate innovations.
Okay, thanks, Duan. So this webinar is about developing and testing innovations. So far, we've mostly talked about developing innovations, and we need to move on to testing them or evaluation. But it's worth noting first that much of what we have described so far has an element of evaluation about it. This is brought out in the YJB materials on evaluation that we've referred to, which separate evaluation activity into the before, during, and after delivery stages. For example, in the pre-delivery stage, there should be some analysis of existing research evidence for the effectiveness of the intervention or interventions like it. And during delivery, there will be what is called formative or process evaluation to assess the quality and fidelity of implementation. What follows links well to what the YJB calls post-delivery evaluation. This is often referred to as summative or impact evaluation. It tends to happen after or towards the end of the intervention. It's an overall assessment of the project's effectiveness and is used to determine whether a project has produced the intended results. A few years ago, at a conference in London, people celebrated the achievements of a series of government-funded early intervention projects. All of them, delegates were told, had been a resounding success. 30 years earlier, some criminologists declared that all interventions in the criminal justice field were useless. We're suspicious of both claims. It's probably not as bad as some people make out, but nor is it as good as others suggest. Somewhere between nothing works and everything works lies the truth. But how do we find out? The answer is by subjecting interventions to a fair and rigorous test. We do this because we want to share what works with others, to stop doing harm if we are, and to make sure that taxpayers and supporters' hard-earned cash is being spent wisely. This categorically doesn't mean that every intervention should go through a randomized control trial or RCT. The test has to be proportionate. We should use methods suitable for the intervention stage of development. The stronger the intervention, the more exacting the test. Having worked out what your intervention is and what outcomes it is trying to achieve, you need to think about how you will measure those outcomes. There are lots of options. You could undertake structured observation, for example, watching a young person and making notes under agreed headings. Or you could interview a parent or carer. A further and efficient option is to ask young people to complete a questionnaire about themselves, or ask a parent or professional to do so on a young person's behalf. If you use a questionnaire, spend some time exploring what researchers call standardized measures. These are collections of questions on a given topic that are easy to answer. There are hundreds of them, covering every outcome from behavior and health to emotions and education. Often they're free to use, and many are short, perhaps as just 5 items long. And they're simple to use. Ticking boxes is often all that is required. Most importantly, standardized measures are tried and tested. They measure what they say they measure, and we can be confident that people will complete them. So where possible, build measures into routine data collection, for example, initial assessments and case closure. In other words, systematize them. Next, you need to think about when to collect these outcome measures. At minimum, do it before and after the intervention is delivered. The difference between these measures will give an indication of the distance travelled. It doesn't, however, tell you whether the intervention was responsible for this change. As we noted in webinar 2, this is because there are other influences on outcomes beside the intervention, perhaps changes in family circumstances, or a new policy, or a child simply maturing. This is where a comparison group is critical. The acid test is whether young people who get the intervention do better than similar young people who don't. Perhaps the intervention stops drug misuse going up by as much. That's a good result. The comparison helps us to isolate the effects of the intervention. So how do you find a comparison group? Well, one option is to take the young people destined for the intervention and match them with similar young people elsewhere. For example, they might be served by youth offending teams in a neighbouring local authority. Better still, take the group of young people who are eligible for your intervention and effectively flip a coin to decide who gets the intervention and who gets services as usual. This is what researchers call random allocation, and it's core to doing randomized controlled trials. It's important to stress that an evaluation that uses random allocation is no guarantee of quality. There are good RCTs and bad RCTs. One that is badly designed, or badly conducted, or badly written up, or all three of these, is of little value. As indicated, a lot of work is needed on intervention design before it's ready for this level of scrutiny. You need to be crystal clear what the intervention is, including its desired outcomes, target group, core components, and underlying logic and evidence. There's no point testing something rigorously unless you know what it is and are confident that it will work. You also need to be able to replicate the intervention reasonably well, hence the work proposed earlier in this webinar on system readiness. Without this, it is unlikely that the intervention will be implemented properly, and you will end up evaluating what is effectively something else, not the intervention you designed. Before launching into a randomized control trial, however, you will want to have done some user testing as well. For example, do young people or families use the intervention? Do they like it? What needs adjusting? Qualitative methods such as focus groups are useful here. And it's vital not to try to do robust impact evaluation alone. You will definitely need external expertise, most likely from a university or research centre. You will also need money, because rigorous evaluations done well are not cheap. We said earlier that it helps to think about honing and testing an innovation in terms of levels of evidence. The standards of evidence developed for the Greater London Authority's Project Oracle include 5 levels, from good intentions at the bottom to proven model at the top. It isn't possible to go from zero to hero overnight. It took years of research and design and testing, for example, including dozens of manned and unmanned space missions before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. That one giant leap for mankind started with some beginner steps many years earlier in a laboratory some 400,000 kilometers away back on planet Earth. A more sensible approach is to take one step at a time and focus on what is needed to move up to the next level of evidence. To reach the top, a multi-site randomized control trial involving independent evaluators is necessary, but requirements in the earlier stages are more modest, and appropriately so. Some tightening up of the intervention, some simple pre-post tests, some user reflections. Evaluation is not about finding out about and describing everything. It is finding out about the things that matter. You want to know what difference the intervention has made to young people, their families, and the wider community. You also want to know what is going well, what is going not so well, and what could be done differently, and whether you have used time, resources, and money effectively. Getting to all this takes time when going through the innovation to impact pipeline. That brings our input on how to develop and test innovations in practice to a close. We're now going to move on to our discussion, and I know Duan has been collating some questions for us to answer.
Okay, Nick, we've got a question here. It says, how can you make sure that there is good evidence underpinning your intervention?
Okay, thanks. It's a good question. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that it depends, of course, what stage your intervention is at. And as we've tried to indicate in this webinar, interventions that are much more developed, by definition, should have stronger evidence base to support them. But there's other kinds of evidence you want to gather to support your intervention. And I'm just going to go through a few of them now. So, for example, you want to have some evidence that there is a need to be met. And that can be gathered in various ways. There may be some secondary data reports available in the area that you're working in. There may have been some case file audits. There may have been some local focus groups or community meetings that indicate that there's a level of need for the intervention you're proposing. You might also want to gather along the way some evidence of people wanting to do the intervention, or of people being willing to implement the intervention. So some consumer testing is valuable going along the way as well. I guess then there are other things that you could focus on. We talked earlier about the importance of developing a logic model, and ideally you would have evidence to support different aspects of the logic model. So we talked about the theory of a problem. In other words, the risk factors that contribute to the poor outcome that you're trying to prevent or address. So some evidence from the literature of that chain of risk that you are proposing, or that you're basing your intervention on, that there's good evidence that chain really exists. In the same vein, thinking about the logic model, you would want some evidence that the kind of things you're proposing as part of your intervention are known to have some benefit for the problem you're concerned with. So, for example, if you're trying to address the behaviour or the antisocial behaviour of 13-year-olds, that there will be a lot of evidence out there about what works in those things. So as we said earlier, you don't need to start from scratch, and resources like the Youth Justice Board's Effective Practice Library are a good place to go. You could also look at some of the databases of evidence-based programs we've talked about in previous webinars. And of course, there's a wider literature. I think it's important to say you'd want to focus on summaries of the literature. If you start getting into the scientific literature too much, you'll get completely swamped by dozens and probably hundreds of academic papers, and you don't want to get to that level of detail. You want to go in at a higher level and look at summaries of evidence, look out for things like systematic reviews or research overviews, where people have looked for all the relevant research in a given area, and they've tried to bring it together in an accessible way.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We also have another question here that says, what do you mean by technical assistance, and who makes a good technical assistance provider? Do you want to answer that, Nick?
Sure, yeah, no, thank you. Well, it helps, I guess, here to look a little bit at some of the evidence-based programs that are already on the market. And when you do this, you'll see that technical assistance takes several forms, and there's no one right way to do it. So often they include some one-to-one guidance from an expert, either in person or over the phone. Some programs have, they might develop a kind of peer network. So, for example, if there is an intervention that is being delivered in various youth offending teams in an area, they might, the people who are mainly responsible in each of those teams might come together once every or 3 times a year or something. That's a good way of people sharing good practice and troubleshooting any problems. Of course, I guess I'd recommend webinars as well. It's a good way of delivering material remotely. And you could also have some kind of regular newsletter or something that people get, and it kind of, again, has examples of best practice and of troubleshooting. But I think probably nothing is better than regular contact with someone who is expert in the intervention. In terms of who makes a good technical assistance provider, well, I guess I've started to talk about that a bit already. Ideally, you want someone who, firstly, knows the intervention well, so they're expert in its content, in the techniques. They're an expert in the rationale underpinning the intervention. They'd also have experience of delivering it, and if they're going to be working with other practitioners and trying to help them, they all, of course, need good interpersonal skills. They need to be supportive, sensitive, enthusiastic, patient, all those kind of things.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. I just got another question here that says, how do I manualize my innovation? Could you give me some guidance on it?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, the process for drawing up a manual, I guess, tends to be iterative, and so it wouldn't be a seamless process from start to finish. What you'd almost certainly be doing is developing successive drafts and then sharing them for comment with relevant stakeholders. And the kind of people you would want to share it with are people who are delivering the intervention, perhaps some people who pay for it, and even people who are on the end of it. They might have some comments as well. I think there are some key headings you'd want to have in there. You obviously want to have a very, very good description of the intervention. If you're talking about the actual manual, you'll almost certainly want to have all the materials in there, whether it's lesson materials or session notes or whatever, or DVDs and summaries of the DVDs. You basically want to make life as easy as possible for the person who's going to be delivering this. We made this distinction between manuals and handbooks, and I guess with handbooks, we were thinking more of the kind of things that support implementation. So it would be some background on the nature of the intervention and its logic and so on, but also some of the protocols for implementing it in a different setting. So there would be things in there about staffing requirements, about the costs. A lot of the stuff I've talked about already in the system readiness section of the webinar.
Great. Well, I think we've got time for one more question, Nick. Yeah. So there's a question here that says, how do I make sure that there is good evidence underpinning my innovation? Oh, did I already do that? I'm sorry. I repeated your question. Sorry about that. Oh, here's another question, the last one. Nick, could you please talk a bit more about training?
Sure, yeah, okay, thanks. Well, again, I think there are different ways if you're thinking about this is all related to developing an innovation. Again, it pays to look at programs that already exist, and they all take different approaches. So some require practitioners to meet in person and to have maybe a couple of days of training. Others are fairly light touch and they require a lone practitioner to work through a DVD or something like that. Some of the training courses last a few days, some are a couple of hours, and of course the media through which they're delivered vary. Some include group discussion, role play, others are less interactive and so on. So I don't think there's a right way to do it. I'm a bit suspicious of interventions that have very minimal training and that don't require any human contact, and there are some of those out there. There are also, of course, I guess more generically, there are lots of guides out there on how to develop training materials, and we obviously recommend that you consult those if that's where you're at with your innovation. You obviously need to do so they cover fairly basic things, I guess, like analysing training needs. In other words, thinking about what kinds of things do people are going to need to be trained in. They would then develop a training course based on that, and typically they break content down into modules. decide the kind of the means of training. Think about obviously who's going to be a suitable trainer. It might be the kind of person I mentioned earlier who's a good technical assistant. So as I say, there's no right way to do it, but there is. Look at evidence-based programs; they offer some good clues, and also look at guides for developing training, of which there are several on the market.
Nick, we just got one last question, and I know we said we weren't taking any more, but it's a good one. It says, what things in this field tend to distort the evidence?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I guess I mentioned earlier the fact that I gave the example of randomized control trials, and I said that there are, just because something has been subjected to a randomized control trial doesn't mean that it is good. And just randomized control trials are good and bad, and they get distorted by different things. So obviously they can be badly designed, they can be badly executed, and they can be badly written up, and all of those things bring in some degree of bias. So, for example, if they are badly designed and they don't have the right number of young people in them, and this would go for any study, not just randomized control trials. If a study doesn't have the right number of young people in it, or it has so the numbers aren't big enough, or the measures are the wrong measures, perhaps they don't quite measure what they're supposed to measure, they're not very reliable or valid, then that obviously distorts the evidence, and you could come out saying that something is effective when it really hasn't been properly tested. The execution of the evaluation method is obviously important as well. A major problem in our field is dropout during interventions, and it's very common for lots of young people or families to drop out during an intervention, so that by the end you're left with a much smaller group than you started with. And the ones who tend to drop out tend to have the most serious needs at the beginning. So if you didn't take that into account, you might say, well, we started off with a really difficult group of young people, and when we got to the end, hey presto, they were all we had a group with a much lower level of need, and you could conclude that the program was effective, when of course that's not the case. It's all to do with the dropout. And I guess the other thing, as I say, that distorts the evidence is the way these things are written up, and it's important that studies are written up properly, that they tell you very clearly who was involved, what information was collected from them, how that was done, how the data was analysed. You need some precision around all of those things, and if you don't get that, then you should be suspicious. There are some guidelines that exist now for people who are writing up evaluation studies. For example, in the field of randomized control trials, there's something called the consort guidelines, and they spell out in detail how you should write up a randomized control trial, so that the person who reads it is armed with all the information they need to judge whether it's a good study, and they can be confident in its results.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. We've now reached the end of the webinar. So on behalf of Nick and I just want to say thank you.